Hey guys, so today we're going to discuss a social issue, which is child abuse and neglect, which is kind of a major thing in the United States especially. We are the #1 industrialized nation when it comes to death rate because of the effects of child abuse and neglect. In the U.S. alone, 4 to 7 children die every day from the effects of child abuse and neglect. So it's a major issue. To put that into perspective, that's about 25% of the average elementary school classroom that's dying every day. And one study found that they took a group of 21-year-olds who reported they experienced child abuse in the past. 80% of those 21-year-olds had at least one mental illness as well, on top of the child abuse and neglect. And a lot of those mental illnesses go untreated, so it's really unclear how long they've been living with a mental illness. So a lot of these kids in our classrooms could potentially have child abuse experiences in their life and accompanying mental health issues, and we would have no idea because they're just flying right under the radar. So there's two big things that I want to talk about that would help address this issue. The first thing is we, as teachers, as educators, need to be trauma informed when we're working with these kids. We need to realize and understand not only how common the trauma is, but how deep the effects really go. The second thing is that child abuse is kind of a hard thing to address because it's not always blatantly obvious. So one thing is that we are mandatory reporters. That's a very serious job, and there should be a good level of training to help us be confident in when we should report, and just to know that it's okay to report if you think that something's going on or any kind of suspicion. And then the other part of that is that the agencies that we report to need to be restructured. In that, firstly, a lot of the reports that you file here in Kansas, we report to the Department of Children and Families, and they have contracted through St. Francis, so they handle investigating all of those cases. St. Francis has a program with their employees. So the social workers, they get assigned to a case. They do everything relating to that case. They drug test the parents. They make recommendations to the court based on their observations and their time spent with the children and observing in the foster home and with a biological parent if they are removed. So once a child is removed, so say you filed a report and you said, I believe this child's being physically abused. They would do their investigation. They would find, okay, yes, we believe this child is being physically abused. The parent is an addict or what have you. They remove the child. There's an extreme shortage of foster homes, and a lot of them are abusive in themselves. So, and that's always a concern. That we have as reporters is when we report, is this going to be a better situation or could it be worse? Because if I'm wrong and they're not being abused, what if they end up in an abusive foster home? So that's the first thing that needs to change. There needs to be more foster homes available, firstly, because that's part of the problem. But the screening process needs to be much more intensive, and they need to follow up and make sure that these foster homes are running as they should be. So the child then gets placed in a foster care home, whether or not it's a good thing. Then the social worker continues to follow up with the foster home and with the child and with the biological parents. They then make recommendations as to what should happen next. Something that a lot of people don't know, and I didn't find this anywhere in my research, just something that I've learned working in mental health, is that St. Francis social workers get a bonus every time they are able to reintegrate a child into their bio parent's home. So regardless of whether or not that's a good thing, every time they put a child back with their parents, they get a monetary bonus. So this has become a major issue, and it's actually being addressed starting to be addressed right now, because there have been many St. Francis workers who have gotten caught falsifying reports to get these kids back in with their abusive parents. And so that's a major issue that we're battling, because when we have these kids that are being physically abused, they're experiencing an unsecure environment. So Dr. Bruce Perry did a ton of work about trauma and how it affects children and adults, but primarily children. So when our brains are developing, we kind of start at the very basic stuff first. All of our survival things, self-regulation skills, that kind of thing. Then we build on top of that higher cognitive functions, being able to problem solve, math skills, making inferences, those kinds of things, expressing your ideas, sharing about feelings. So when we experience traumas, while those areas of our brain are developing, we experience deficits in those areas. So this looks so different for so many different kids. If you have a kid who was, let's say, 1 year old when they started experiencing abuse, they are going to be those kids in your classroom that they can't sit still. They just are defiant, or, those kinds of things. And as teachers, we don't get a lot of training in recognizing those markers where it's not just they have ADHD or they don't want to listen. Physiologically and developmentally, they just aren't there. They cannot do it. And we aren't taught ways to reach those kids. So that creates a huge gap in our classroom. And when we're talking about 25% of our kids, that's a lot of kids falling through the cracks. So that again brings me back to we need more trauma-informed training for school staff. And again, I feel like I have kind of a unique perspective on this because I am in so many different schools. But so many times I see a child that I work with, and they have a high ACE score, which ACE stands for, now I'm not going to be able to tell you, Adverse Childhood Experience. And you kind of get points for bad things that happen to you is the best way to explain it. So kids with high ACE scores have experienced a lot of trauma. Because of that, cognitively, they struggle. They have behavior problems. They can't self-regulate. They're not ready to take in what you're trying to give them. And so many times, when I'm in the schools, I see that teachers are distraught. They don't know what to do with these kids, and they get so frustrated, which then the child picks up on the frustration, and then that escalates them further. And so it's really important that as teachers we get that training on how to handle those kids and how to help them achieve regulation and control the lower areas of their brain so they can reach the higher areas. And sometimes that takes, stopping and doing things that you don't really feel like you should be doing, like an older child needing to be held like a baby. That sometimes is needed, and it's proven through research that that is the best thing for them. But as teachers, we aren't always taught that we should do that, because then we're babying them, and the kind of the stigma with that. So it's going to take a whole mindset change in the whole structure of our school system. First of all, and some effort is being put into that. A lot of schools in this area are starting to become more open to trauma-based trainings, and they're allowing community-based mental health centers to come into the school and provide a school-based therapist, which is really helpful both in educating staff and assisting the children. So as that continues to grow, and as educators partner with mental health facilities, that should help in understanding and addressing child abuse, because mental health professionals, that's one of their main focuses, is focusing on abuse and trauma. And so utilizing those resources and partnering. And then also, again, the restructuring of DCF is going to help a lot, which is in the works, but it's still pretty far away. So, in review, we talked about child abuse, which is child abuse or neglect is any time when we are failing to act in the best interest of the child, we're putting them at risk. Sometimes this looks like hitting the child. Sometimes this looks like verbal abuse. Sometimes this looks like letting the child dangle off a cliff, even though we know that's extremely dangerous. And so when kids are put in these situations, it affects their learning because they don't feel safe. So their brainstem and their primitive brain isn't letting them regulate. So they're going 100 miles an hour. They're scared. And their brain is like, we can't learn because we need to worry about surviving. So that creates a huge problem in our classrooms for us. One thing that I want to make sure that I make very clear is the United States leads on effects of child abuse. We have so many kids who are impacted by this, and our rates just continue to rise, which tells us that the roadblocks that we have and the things that we're trying to do to cut down on this problem and help assist just aren't working. They aren't proving to be effectual. So we have to make a change to make sure that this number doesn't jump from 25 to 50% of our kids that are being affected in our classroom. So again, that would require more intensive training on the effects of child abuse, because it's probably not going to go away because it's such a hard issue to address. And then again, the restructuring of DCF so that when those children are identified, they can get in a better environment and they can stay there and they can get some security there and not constantly wondering, where am I going to go next? Am I going back home? Are these people treating me the way that a regular family should be treating me? And that kind of thing. And once we see that, then those kids that are being abused, they can get help both in school and out of school. And it's going to take collaboration and partnership. And it's going to take some major changes. So it's best that we get started now so that 10, 15 years from now, we can start seeing those rates drop, because it's a huge systematic change that will have to take place.